Well, folks, welcome back to another episode of Expected by Whom, a delayed episode thanks to the daily flavor of daycare illness that knocked me out during our scheduled recording time last week. As always, I'm Prashanth Iyer. With me is Sean Shapiro. We appreciate everybody tuning in to Expected by Whom, a podcast exploring the world of hockey through unique lenses, brought to you by the Wing Wheel Podcast. We know a lot of you tuning in are Red Wings fans, and the Wing Wheel Podcast is the biggest and best Detroit Red Wings show out there. Find the show wherever you listen to or watch your podcasts, and go to wingwheelpodcast.com for more. And so, Sean, sort of in our conversations this week, one of the things that's come up both in the Twitter sphere and kind of beyond is how do we contextualize what Sergei Bobrovsky's done? You know, he's obviously had a tremendous run since being inserted in for Alex Lyon in the first round against Boston, then knocks out Toronto, knocks out Carolina. You know, so now you've taken out 3 of the top 5 teams in the NHL. How do we really contextualize where his performance falls?
Well, first of all, glad to see you're you're upright on your feet and everything, because I unfortunately also know the realities of the daycare bug of the week, as you can call it sometimes. Anywho, there's a couple things about Bobrovsky that are really interesting to me, and I really want to talk about kind of the historical context in a minute here on the context, but there's 2 other big things that have really popped up for me watching this playoffs and where they are. One is the bit of one has been somehow we need to get into a debate already about Matthew Tkachuk versus Sergei Bobrovsky. Like, that to me has already been a bit of ridiculous, where they're both great stories. They're both driving their teams. They're both such a big part of it. And I know people have to put out Conn Smythe rankings and things like that, but the thing's a little bit ridiculous. And also at times, and I've seen the arguments on the Twitter sphere where somehow Matthew Tkachuk is not driving play all the time, and I somehow am missing that just because the goals are going in at the end of games. It's not so I'm missing that. And then the other thing is, and as much as like you look at it's so weird to see, like, okay, we're cherry picking 2 things against each other that are both great that are happening for the sport. That's the one. The other thing, and I think you and I have touched on this on the show, but we have, of the 3 Final Four teams, of the 3 Final Four teams, 3 of them by either choice or by design relied on the tandem in the playoffs and relied on the tandem and the goaltender level. I mean, Ottinger, we're recording this on Monday night before Game 6 of the Dallas series. I think tonight will be Ottinger's 82nd or 81st game of the season between the regular season and the playoffs, while Adin Hill will be playing his something like his 40th or something like that, right around there. And you can see Ottinger's obviously was great in Game 5, and he's shown, but we've seen the downswings in Ottinger's plays, while we've seen Hill has been really good and hasn't had that kind of wear out that we see from a goalie who's played 80-something games. Bobrovsky is another perfect example of that, where he came from Alex Lyon, started the playoffs, and I mean, Bobrovsky's someone who I talked to someone when I was in Dallas last week, and they pointed out where, honestly, if not for and obviously I really hope whatever is happening with Spencer Knight, I really hope that he's okay. And obviously there's a very serious human interaction and importance to that. But there's also a level from a hockey level where I talked to some people who felt that if they had gone to the playoffs and Knight wasn't hurt or Knight wasn't in the player assistance program, Bobrovsky might not even be dressing. Bobrovsky might be the number 3. It might be Lyon, then Knight, and we may never even get to Bobrovsky. So Bobrovsky is, from the hockey perspective, there's that, and he came in and he's fresh, and he hadn't played for 3.5 weeks or whatever it was before he steps in, and now it's like it's kind of showing proof of life where there's only so many goalies in the world, and even the greatest ones, like the Stars, are looking at this series where they are obviously very happy with Ottinger and closeout games and that stuff, but I know for a fact they're looking at the evidence and saying, we can't play him this much next year. We have to play him less. We have to be able to get an impact like we get from the Vegas is getting from a fresh Adin Hill, that Florida is getting from a fresh Bobrovsky, what Carolina was getting from being able to go to a number 2 after, even though they lost the game, to be able to go to a number 2 after a 4 overtime game. I know Dallas is talking about that lesson because they look at, they were in this spot. They thought they had the ability to have Ottinger play less games this year, but because of Scott Wedgwood's injury, they didn't have a number 3 they really trusted. So if you look at the offseason stuff and teams building their things, expect Dallas to look for a real legitimate number 3 in the offseason. And that's just it's just proof of life to this goaltending trend where NHL goalies, it's such a physically taxing sport, mentally taxing sport that you can't have a guy. Ottinger is going to really break a trend. If Dallas does this thing, it's going to be one of the last times we're going to see a guy who have played this much hockey and won a cup. I just think that's going to be the trend of the future. Even Tampa is looking, how do we have Vasilevsky play less? We saw him scale back this year. And so those two are the big things for me right off the top. And Bob, the other one, and now this is a thing I really want to get into looking at some of these models, is how do we contextualize this for history? Because we're watching it in front of us. It's great. We're seeing the moment. We're seeing it in front of our eyes. But when you look at when you take a look at how he is, how does this compare to history to me? And this is one of the things where I think it's kind of a really cool tool we have. And I'll let you talk here. I know I've been rambling, but like we have a really cool tool here looking at the evolving hockey data going back to 07-08, I believe, just to look at how this compares to about 15 years of playoffs here. And I'll let you talk because I was talking too much, and I know I'm trying to be better about that. I promise, people. I promise.
I mean, it's all valid points that you're raising here, and obviously, when you go to contextualize what Bobrovsky has done, it's sort of hard finding the best marks because we don't really have perfect estimates of goalie or goalie performance because there are a lot of variables that go in that, ultimately we don't have access to be able to include in models, such as where is the goalie positioned, where the defender's in front of them, was the goalie screened, things along those lines. That all complicates our ability to evaluate goalies, but sort of the best mark we've got right now is goals saved above expected, which again, it takes the sum of the probabilities of the shots that they face. So basically, look at every single shot, unblocked shot that a goalie faced, calculate what's the likelihood that shot would go into the net, sum up all of that for all the shots the goalie faced, and that's the amount of goals that should have gone in against a particular goalie. When we talk about then goals saved above expected, it then comes down to, okay, let's say the sum of the probabilities was 3. The goalie should have given up 3 goals and only 2 goals went in. That means that goalie saved 1 goal above expected. And so when we come to talk about Bobrovsky, by evolving hockey's model, he saved nearly 22 goals above expected through 14 games, which is absolutely ridiculous and is the second highest mark in evolving hockey's database, going back to 07-08, only behind Shesterkin from last year when Shesterkin was on an absolute heater. And even then, Shesterkin was around 23 goals saved above expected, and he did that in 20 games. So we're talking about Bob's played 6 fewer games and has only saved 2 fewer goals saved above expected. Now, all that being said, I think it's important to talk about some of the limitations of the model. Fundamentally, the model is limited to the information that we have now, and I sort of highlighted that. There's also, some people have brought up the theory that certain venues or certain arenas tend to overcount quality chances close. So an example of this is, a lot of people believe Carolina maybe on a rebound play will count 2 or 3 shots that were saved by a goalie from 4 or 5 feet away, when really there was maybe only 1 shot in there. But it's really hard to know how many were in there to quantify that. So the scorekeeper is sort of making their best estimate there. But because shot distance is the most important value, having a shot from 4 feet away is going to create a high XG shot and therefore may inflate a goalie's totals. I've actually looked into this, at least for this particular season. You can very crudely do this by looking at home versus road splits. and how the shots are actually recorded and what's the actual expected goal per shot taken. And it would really amount to a difference of about 1.5 goals over 2 or 3 games. And so it's not a substantial mark, but it is certainly inflated to a degree. That being said, take nothing away from Sergei Bobrovsky. He's been absolutely unbelievable. Goals saved above expected only goes back to 07-08. Obviously, for me and a lot of Red Wings fans, the gold standard for goaltending performance in the playoffs is J.S. Jaguar in 2003. What he did against the Wings in the first round sweep, saving, 60 shots in that first game and then basically dominating everybody there on his way to a .992 save percentage against the Minnesota Wild. Yes, it is .992. He gave up 1 goal in 4 games. That, for me, will always be the gold standard, but I think you have to say that Bobrovsky's performance is probably one of the 2 or 3 best goalie performances we've seen since 2003.
Yeah, you bring up an important context of, I think adding that time frame and that timestamp is important, because I think one of the easy catch-all statements can become, it's like, oh, well, this is one of the greatest goaltending performances of all time. And I don't have an issue with that statement, but I think sometimes it gets lost when someone will go and pull up, hey, this is Bobrovsky's goals saved above expected. But we don't have that data from before 2003. We don't have people think of the historically great goaltender performances, and you think of Patrick Waugh and the years where it's the narrative, and it's a wonderful story, but all we really have is the data that he won every game or won 10 games in overtime on his way to the cup, right? Like things like that. And so I think it's important to bring that up. And then it's important to apply this and look at this perspective in a historical vacuum of, I think the other thing about, I guess I knew Shesterkin was good last year. I think looking at this, I didn't realize, I think I maybe underappreciated how good Shesterkin was last year, because I think one of the things that when you look at the data set and it really shows you is Bobrovsky had all highs, and we talked earlier about how he hasn't played as many games, and he comes in fresh, and he's doing this in 14 games. He hasn't had the really bad start. He hasn't had the games where he got tanked, and those are the ones that you often forget about when you look about it. Like before we talked about the show, you often think about the Jaro Halak run with Montreal, right? And it's like he's all the way down when I look at this list, right? He is like Halak was when I use all time, like, I mean, the fact that Halak is 44th on this list when I rank all the data, like I look at that and it's like, there's no way Halak's performance with Montreal in 09-010 is that far below like a guy like because I covered Dallas extensive, obviously, like Anton Khudobin, as wonderful as that a story was during the 1920 season, Anton Khudobin wasn't that great of a goaltender. Like he was a really good story. He was above his station, and he was playing like a starter when he was normally the journeyman. But Anton Khudobin what Anton Khudobin in 1920 should not be 25 spots better on a top 50 list of what Halak did. But it all goes back to Bobrovsky hasn't had that really bad start. He hasn't had that, like, it's good to timestamp this type of stuff sometimes, because like Florida could go into game 1 and 2 against either Dallas or Vegas and just get cranked, and all of a sudden we're looking at something really bad here. So, or not really bad, but just looking at something there. So, to me, this data, it makes me look back and think on, there's two things that come to mind. Obviously, I underappreciated what Shesterkin did last year. As much as I appreciated it, I still underappreciated how good it was. And also, Henrik Lundqvist was an amazing goaltender. Like, you go through this data and like, you look at what he did for someone who never won a cup, and you look how often he pops up year over year over year. And, he's a guy who will never have enough Vezinas for what he actually was.
I mean, that's one of the things that always comes up for me when I'm going through this data and putting out graphics is like, is it really fair that Rangers fans got to go from Richter to Lundqvist to Shesterkin? Like, that's not fair. But all that being, set aside, I think, again, you bring up some good points. Shesterkin, it comes back to the Carolina thing. He had a 7-game series against Carolina last year. For the people that want to tout that Carolina overcounts, getting 4 games in Carolina's arena, did that substantially impact his numbers? Potentially, we'll never know. I think ultimately going back to what you said, though, about the historical performances, one name that you never hear come up in all of these conversations is Dominik Hasek. But Dominik Hasek was unbelievable in the playoffs. We just don't have the data to really say how good he was. People forget in that 98-99 run, when he carried that Buffalo Sabres team to the final against Dallas, Hasek had a save percentage of .940 in the playoffs. That is ridiculous to have a .940 save percentage in the playoffs. And even more so, that wasn't even his best save percentage in a series. You go back a couple years prior and he loses a 7-game series despite having a .950 save percentage. A .950 save percentage. This is the kind of guy where if you had that data, we would just be completely losing our minds over how good Hasek is. And we already do to a certain extent. At least I do, because I am a big Dominik Hasek fan and goalie truther, and it's why I hold all goalies against him, and therefore no goalie will ever be as good in my eyes to Dominik Hasek. But ultimately, we can really only contextualize Bob in the last 15 years where we have goals saved above expected. I think the point you made about timestamping it is key. The other point that I'll add to this here is we are in the midst of seeing an uptick in the average shot quality increasing. And what that thereby allows is every save a goalie makes is an opportunity to maybe add a little bit more to their goals saved above expected than a goalie's prior, because the average shot is now a more dangerous shot than it was in years prior. And so that's why if you go and look at this in evolving hockey, I think you'll see a lot of the years are more recent years as compared to 07, 08, 08, 09, things like that. So that may be another reason why you have Bob a little bit higher. All that being said, I still come back to, when I'm thinking about top goalie performances, and again, I'll use 03 as my cutoff with Jaguar being there. Dwayne Rolison in 05, 06 with Edmonton. I think he was absolutely dynamite. We talk about Halak in 2009, 2010. Antti Niemi in Chicago had a couple of great runs. Ben Bishop in Tampa obviously had some great runs there that we can't forget about. Jonas Hiller with the Ducks, kind of late 2010s. He was another guy that, again, didn't get a lot of credit. Mike Smith in Arizona had a lot of great runs. But really, I think this Bobrovsky one is probably right up there with Halak in 09-10 in terms of just emotions, and then Shesterkin last year. I think those are probably the two best ones I've seen since Jaguar in 03.
With Bob, one of the things it's kind of one of the things that is going to be really interesting about the legacy of this and everything is, I'm really interested to see, because I don't think we can ignore the fact that he didn't play for 3.5 weeks. Like, I think there is something where we can't ignore that. Like, it makes what Shesterkin did even more impressive, because we know Shesterkin was playing like game 80 something or like that. And even like a lot of these other ones, like the Shesterkin one is one done in a traditional season, in a traditional time frame, and a goalie playing in those 70 to 80 games in a season. You look at the other ones up top, I mean, nothing against what Vasilevsky did during the 2021 season, but it was also a season where that was a 56 games. It was 2021, 56, whatever. It was the first one outside of COVID where it was posted there. The Hiller one was done in 08, 09. They only had 13 games. And so to me, the Bobrovsky sample size of this, that you always need to apply the caveat, is this is what a goalie can do when he doesn't play for 3.5 weeks and he's fresh. Like, this is just the reality of it. He was a really fresh goaltender. I mean, Adin Hill is looking tremendous for Vegas, and somebody is going to make the mistake of, not to make the mistake of signing Adin Hill, somebody's going to make the mistake of thinking Adin Hill should play 60 games because of it. Like, I think Adin Hill is a perfect case of you need that big asterisk so you make the right decision in July. Because one of the reasons Hill is playing at the level he is because he's one of 4 goalies Vegas used, and he's fresh and all of that stuff. And I think with Bobrovsky, he's going to have a chance to be fresh again in the final. The fact is he's going to have 10 days because Wednesday it'll be 10 days between games for him. So he'll have a chance to go in and be fresh again for that series right off the top. And so I expect those numbers, whether Florida wins or loses this whole thing, will continue to go up. And it's a really interesting discussion to have when it comes to goaltending now, because Bob is proving 2 different things right at the same time. He's proving that you need a goalie tandem. He's also proving that his own salary is ridiculous. That's the other part where he's also proving that you can't invest in one goaltender like that because you have to be able to have the other horses to get it all done, to not spend the $10 million on one goalie. It's fascinating to watch a guy who, with his play, on one reason we keep talking about, he's a $10 million goalie. He's playing like a $10 million goalie. Well, no, he's playing like a tandem goalie. And that's fine, but he's proving, and the lesson that people will need to take, and the fringes that people will need to take from this, is the people that look at the lesson of Adin Hill, that look at the lessons of Bob coming in to this series after Lions started, will be the 1B, the tandem setup, and that will be the lasting lesson that you should take, as opposed to you pay Sergei Bobrovsky $10 million because he's Sergei Bobrovsky.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely spot on. I mean, you look at the team that Florida beat in the Eastern Conference Final in Carolina, their 3 goalies were combined paid, I think, a little over $7.5 million. Freddie Anderson was at 4.5, Antti Ranta was at $2 million, and then Kochetkov, the guy who's going to really be taking over as their starter down the road, was under $1 million because he's on his entry-level contract. And so, there's a lot of ways to get it done. And ultimately, that, I think for me, there's a really interesting dynamic here with Bob, like you brought up. I think, one, the piece of this for Bob in and of itself is, if he goes on and leads his team, to the championship, wins the Conn Smythe, he's absolutely cemented himself as a Hall of Famer. 2 Vezinas, 2 year-end All-Stars, and now a Conn Smythe and a Stanley Cup. I mean, at that point, I think he's basically a Hall of Famer, and he's cemented it. So there's a lot of incentive in that reason there. But the second piece is going back to exactly what you said in terms of that tandem, that 1A, 1B. This was talked about a lot with when Lundqvist was still in the league, when he was sort of him and Jonathan Quick were maybe the atypicals, and really this whole primary starter thing mostly died out when Martin Brodeur retired. You weren't having guys play 73 games in a regular season anymore. But it's really, really interesting to see how being able to keep Bob fresh, it's almost like being able to bring in that ringer in the playoffs and just let him, unleash the best of his abilities. And, it's the same thing why you have to hope teams don't make the mistake with Adin Hill, given what he's been able to do this postseason. It's what a lot of people thought that Ville Husso would do, right? After playing 40 games in St. Louis, starting 38 for them and then being the starter in the playoffs. A lot of people thought you can bring him over, and Detroit try to play him 56 games, and he certainly wore down by the end of the year. And that's really the lesson here, is I think you have to not only be able to run 1A, 1B, you really also have to have that third goaltender that you're not afraid to put in. Toronto was not afraid to put in Joseph Woll into that playoff series and let him run. Granted, they didn't have a lot of options with Samsonov being hurt and Matt Murray being questionable, but you really have to be able to run 3 deep now. Florida's shown you that. Carolina showed you that. Toronto showed you that. Boston showed you 2 goalies until they went away from it, and that sort of messed things up. I think it'll be very interesting to watch how much this impacts teams moving forward with their goalie salaries and ultimately how they play their goalies night in and night out.
Well, to go even further, like, it's one of the lost storylines of the 15-16 Penguins is Jeff Zakoff started 2 games. Like, I know it's everyone looks at the Matt Murray, Marc-Andre Fleury story, but like, people forget they started the playoffs because of injury, with Jeff Zakoff. And of the teams in the Final Four, Dallas, it's funny because his name is, their third string goalie would be Matt Murray, but it's the other Matthew Murray. But of the 4 teams in the Final Four, the one that is incredibly fortunate that their starter never got hurt is the team that doesn't have a number 3. Like Carolina, has played 3. You've had, you just touched on all 3 with Kochetkov and everything like that. Florida, with Alex Lyon was their 3, and obviously the Spencer Knight situation we touched on earlier. Vegas has played four goalies, and they went and traded for Jonathan Quick at the deadline as another. Like, that's a lasting lesson where none of these teams, Dallas is kind of lucky to be where they are because Jake Ottinger didn't break down. The other teams in the Final Four are here because they prioritized goaltender depth beyond 1 and 2. And to be on a quick aside, since I know we have many Red Wings fans listening, a Husso Hill handed would not be bad. I'm not anti Aiden Hill signing. I am just, do not look at Aiden Hill as a 60 game guy. If you get a Hill, Husso, 41 games each, both pushing, and then you go with the better guy in the playoffs, go with that. But I'm good with that concept of it. But that would be, to me, one of the bigger things of, let's look at why this is and why this is happening. And I would love to see, like we talked earlier on the show, past couple episodes about like historical data we'd love to see. I'd love to be able to go back into a time machine and get some of these things. And I want to go back to a point you made about arena impact. And it's one of the things that I got a pretty good story. So when I was covering the Texas Stars, this would have been during the 13, and so this is 13-14 Calder Cup playoffs. And Christopher Nilstorp was the goalie. Nilstorp played like 5 or 6 career NHL games, came over to North America for 2 years, went back to Sweden, everything like that. But after game, it was the second round. It was the series against Grand Rapids, actually. And after one of the games, Texas won that game by like 2 or 3 goals, so it was okay to discuss these type of things. Nilstorp is walking around and basically going up to anyone in a suit that he didn't know and asking them, were you the one counting shots tonight? Were you the one counting shots tonight? Because it was the difference and the impact that a statistician has on the number 3 goalie market. I don't think people realize how much that is. I've had really good conversations with Mike McKenna about this before, where even down to the AHL levels, where some buildings are, I've heard, I'm going to have to ask Mike I think Rockford is one where it's very kind to goaltenders, but I might have it the opposite. I'd have to double check. But basically, it's the statistician and the person counting the shots and the person counting that, they have such an impact on the livelihood of goalies, because where we still have the rudimentary stats in the AHL, the difference between a 9-11 versus a 9-15 save percentage in the AHL is the difference between being, hey, I'm now a 3A, a 4A player versus I'm a career minor leaguer. Just having the count there. So it goes beyond just the NHL. It extends down, and the goalies and the goalie coaches know which buildings give them more love than others. And it's a bit like, that would be a great project, right? Like, it would be great to just kind of create these isolations of like people will sometimes do like the tax dollar thing of like, what is if a guy signs for 10 million, to pick an easy round number, if a guy signs for 10 million in LA, it's really worth $10 million contract in LA would be this much if he signed in Vegas, which is a tax exempt state, or if he signed in Toronto, like it would be great to be like to be able to create that isolate of like, you know what, a 920 save percentage or let's just use a 900, like we'll pick a nice round number, a 900 save percentage in Tampa would really be I'm making this up, would be a 906 with LA if you moved LA's shot counters there. Like, I'd love to like create this master document. It would be like, this would be I don't know how we would do that, but I would love that document.
Well, so, funnily enough, you give an amazing segue here, as our guest on today's show has done that. And you can actually read the entire write-up on his website. This is Micah McCurdy of HockeyViz. And so one of the things you'll notice whenever you go to Money Puck, HockeyViz, Evolving Hockey, and you look at their expected goals data, you'll notice that there's an option to score and venue adjust. And that actually is taking into account the different rinks across the league where there are different scorer biases. Obviously, the most notable one that really prompted the start of all of this was the New York Rangers back in 2007, 2008, where at home they averaged, almost 3.5 expected goals per 60 minutes. But on the road, they were averaging 2.2. And you're going, either this team is playing vastly different home and away, or there's something up with recording the shots. And sure enough, multiple people dug into this. Micah, I think, has done it most notably, where you can actually compare the average scorer error by rink for all teams going back from 2007, 2008, all the way through 2019, 2020. So we're very fortunate that Micah took some time out of his day to join us for an interview to talk a little bit about everything he's done with HockeyViz, a little bit about his model, which is called Magnus 6, and some of the things he wishes he had and what he was wishing to work on. But before we jump into that interview, if you'd like to support our show, please subscribe to the Wing Wheel Podcast on Patreon. That's patreon.com/wingwheelpodcast. By subscribing, you're not only unlocking more great benefits like Wing Wheel Podcast's exclusive Discord, which has an Expected by Whom dedicated channel, bonus episodes, and more. You're also supporting us as we're a part of the Wing Wheel Podcast Content Network. So without further ado, let's bring on Micah. And as a note to all of our listeners and viewers, this was recorded last week. This was recorded last Wednesday, I believe, or last Tuesday, right after the Jamie Benn incident. So you will get a little snippet of Sean having to leave the interview to go ask Jamie Benn why he cross-checked Mark Stone in the neck. All right. So that being said, let's go into the interview. All right, folks, we're back with a third edition of Ask the Builders. This time we have the esteemed Dr. Micah McCurdy on our show today, and we're very excited to have Micah. Micah, thank you for taking the time to join us.
Thank you. Pleasure's all mine.
And so, without further ado, the format of this should be familiar to those who have listened already, so we're going to dive right into it. Specifically, we're going to be focusing on Micah's Magnus 6 even strength shot rates model, which you can find on his website, HockeyViz.com. Micah, one of the generous things that he does for the community is all of his write-ups are free and accessible. That should not stop you from subscribing to his website and giving Micah more money, because that allows Micah to give us more nice things. But, kind of getting back to the model in and of itself, as simply as possible, can you break down what goes into your measurement of individual player even strength shot rates, kind of what variables are in there, what's sort of the most important, and what you do that's maybe unique from the other models that attempt to estimate this?
Okay, so the first thing to understand is that for the purposes of estimating like individual player impact at 5-on-5, which is, the most important part of the game, I use two models. One is the XG model itself. So that's measuring just per shot. How dangerous is that shot that just happened? And so that has its own questions, and that's really the foundational piece, which is how dangerous was that chance? Then I have an extra model, a second model, on top of that, which tries to measure who is responsible for what happened. So then you have a certain pattern of shots over a certain length of time. And then you can say, well, I know who was on the ice, who is actually causing those shots to be taken either for their team or for the other team. So one of the first one is just per shot. There's really nothing in it except there was a shot. Was it dangerous? If so, how dangerous? And the second piece has a time component. We only have so much hockey to play. Who is generating shots in a given time and who is not?
So that's terrific in terms of being able to understand kind of what's going into that 5-on-5 estimate. One of the things that I think is unique about your model relative to other models is the baseline that you set for each player sort of heading into a season. I think most people, if you're familiar with sort of model building, we talk about this in the sense of priors and whether it's an informed prior or not. But I was wondering, Mike, if you can share a little bit about kind of when you're evaluating those players over a particular period of time, what's going into that in terms of that prior?
So my habit is to use every estimate from the end of every season as the prior for the beginning of the next season. So if you get a situation where, for instance, you have a player like Mark Stone, who's well known to be a great play driver, who's dominating play in his shifts. If you forget each summer that he's who he is, and then he plays with new line mates, it's very easy, especially if you have a situation like that where he plays with a rookie, it's very easy to look at the rookie's play and say, well, maybe it's him driving it. When if you know the history of the player, then you know that you strongly suspect that in fact it's just Mark Stone who is still extremely good. And that, in fact, I've been toying with possibly changing that to even make it sort of more historically smooth by looking at pairs of seasons as my prior rather than just single seasons. So looking back for a player's history. And that's informed by, among other things, my base belief about the sport itself, which is the human performance, because it's predicated on human factors, changes only slowly. You can do some weight room work in the summer. You can try to stave off the effects of aging. You can learn some more X's and O's. But at the end of the day, what you do on the ice is primarily a matter of what you've learned to train your body to do. And those kinds of human abilities only change slowly. So I think it's important to bake that in as an assumption.
And Micah, to kind of continue on that, we've talked to some others about when we've had them on about sample size and everything like that. I think something just as far as a lot of times people pick at models or they pick at numbers based off using one game, not realizing how much sample size has gone into this. You talk about using the full season there and looking into ways to potentially use 2 seasons. For you, when you look at defining a player in a sample size, how much do we need to see from your perspective? Is it the full season? What do we need to see to actually get a fair read on what a player actually is? Because I love the way you look at it. I also look at it as it's an incredibly random sport, and you can't really know much about a player by watching one game, even 5 games. You need to watch, just by watching the game, you need to watch them 20 to 30 times at a minimum to know what they are as a player. When you look at the sample size, when do you start to feel like this shows us who a player really is? Is it the 82 game mark? Is it a full season? How do you look at that?
It's funny, I think more in terms of minutes than I think in terms of games. But I try, like, as a point of discipline, I try not to think in terms of like, this is enough and that's not enough. I'm sort of greedy. I always want more. No matter how much I've got, I just think however much you have, then a little bit more is a little bit more precise. I don't think there's some amount of precision which is somehow good enough and some amount of precision which is somehow not good enough. Certainly, I don't think there's any question that single games, you can't really sensibly evaluate players in single games. Like, if your defense partner has a bad game, and you're just going to look like trash, even if you were great. And that kind of, to let that stuff come out in the wash, you need to be looking at. My sort of rule of thumb, though, to give you a kind of answer to the question, is that I like to start talking in thousands of minutes, not hundreds of minutes. Like a sort of typical amount for a full team for 82 games is like 5,000 minutes, give or take. So you got to be playing a pretty hefty chunk of a season before you can get a good read on someone. And then, of course, the extra trouble is that the players that are sort of most interesting a lot of the time are rookies, people just breaking into the league, and they're the ones whose natural talent is the most changing. They're physically younger, mentally younger in the sense of having less experience in the game, so they are actually changing faster than players, in their mid-career, which are changing slowest of all. So for rookies, I kind of want a little bit, even more. It's perfectly common to see examples like, if you look at play driving, like Jack Eichel was quite poor for at least a full year, if not two. And, like you wouldn't want to say, well, put your analytics hat on and say, well, he's a dreadful player just because he had dreadful results in his first 2 years. You would want to take the approach that the Sabres did and say, we can tell he's a superstar, even if he's extremely young and he's not putting it together now.
So on kind of that, when you look at your model and you look at it, what do you consider the strengths of your model? When you look at what are the for lack of a better word, the bullet points, the highlights, when someone's talking about this model to use it, what are the strengths that you would highlight when talking to someone about it?
So the strengths that I think are most important are the ones that are the most obvious. In particular, not discarding any data. When you're watching yourself, you naturally gravitate towards the things that you think are important. So, in particular, you look at stick on puck plays. You look at high leverage moments in games. You look at the games that you happen to watch and not the games that for whatever reason you didn't watch. No matter how good your reason was for not being there, you weren't there. Whereas if you have something, that what you can do with a computerized approach is you can make sure that you're including every shot, not just every shot, every shift, and so you're also taking into account the fact that, you just watched a 5-minute stretch of play and your team didn't give up any shots. Well, who was it who didn't give up any shots? Was it those guys or was it those guys? Maybe you don't remember. The model knows. Those kinds of like pure discipline, making sure to get every little bit, which is just incredibly more information than you could possibly ever put in your head at once. And, computers just take that in stride, which is one of the innate virtues of doing a model-based, a disciplined approach. So that's definitely one. And the second piece is related to it, which is just about discipline and being systematic, where your temptation, even if you did watch all those things, you're gonna weight this as higher, you're gonna weight that lower based on some nebulous, possibly well-informed, possibly not, intuition about which plays sort of reveal more about the character of somebody and which ones don't. Character here, I guess, is a kind of broad synonym for ability and talent and all that. And carefully not making those assumptions about which plays matter and which ones don't is infuriating, of course, if your knowledge is all based, if your epistemology is entirely based on I know the sport, which is what experience is for people who do know the sport. But turning that aside lets you say, we are treating this with the even-handedness that it deserves, and we're not gonna let leverage or any other kind of salience outweigh quality.
I think that's a great point on the computer, the model, everything. They can watch. I'm down in Dallas right now, and I watched the game last night, and it's easy to get caught up into a narrative and miss things. It's an emotional storytelling game, and it's wonderful. It's great. It's why I watch it and why I chose a career field to cover it. But at the same time, it lets you miss things. And there's things where you go back and you look at the data, and it allows me to rewatch the game at another way. So I'm praising that. To then flip it, when you look at your model in your space, what are some of the limitations, or what are some of the spaces right now where you look at that, either whether it's technologically or data-wise, what are some of the limitations that you look at right now for moving forward as you continue to build in this space?
So unsurprisingly, the weaknesses often sort of strongly resemble the strengths, where they're sort of the other side of the coin of the same aspects. And so, like, one of the things I toyed with, just to give you an idea of weaknesses, one of the things I toyed with, not this summer, but the last summer, was about leverage weighting all of the minutes. So I thought maybe that, because one of the fundamental assumptions that I use, which I think you have to as a pure matter of practicality, is that in principle, all 10 skaters on the ice affect what happens equally. And the logic behind that, there's a pure practicality of, if it's not equal, what are you going to do? Like what unequal things could you possibly choose for weightings in that sense? But on the other hand, when you watch a particular, especially if you're really nailing down to like a shift level, there are certain shifts where certain players, even if they're fully alert, don't actually affect the play particularly well. They don't get targeted on an entry. Pass that's supposed to come through to them does not. Both offensively and defensively, we can see watching that on a specific shift, you don't have that equal weighting of in terms of actually impacting the play for good or for ill. But, I still think that if you look over a very long sample is one of the reasons why you want to do that. If a person is playing persistently weak, they're going to get targeted. Coaches are going to see, and those weaknesses will get exposed. They might not get exposed every shift, but they'll get exposed eventually. Similarly, strengths, if they can't be used in a particular shift, they'll be used eventually, because teammates, because coaches, because of all of these constant forces that are pushing everybody towards relevance, if you like. It's very difficult to go completely unnoticed on a hockey team for a very, very long time, whether you're extremely good or extremely bad, just because it's very chaotic. It's a very small space. There's physical constraints like that. But I would love, for instance, I know that watching that there are certain players who somehow have this kind of, to steal an NBA analytics where they have a certain gravity, where they pull people towards them, where they pull the puck towards them, and if they screw up, it's a big deal. Although frequently you notice these players more when they're not screwing up, when they're doing great things. And you have this sort of space bending sense where you think, when so-and-so has the puck, like Datsuk was a perfect example of this, where when he had the puck, you would go, oh no. Right? You'd have this immediate, as if the ground underneath your own feet was somehow shaky, which is an emotional response, but it's an emotional response that matches something philosophical about the game, right? Where it's not just, he might shoot the puck and score. He might do, I don't know what he's going to do, right? There's something uncertain. And that, whereas other players, you think, Crosby is a great example, an equally good player to somebody like Datsuk, but then with Crosby, it's going to happen. You have it's not fun if he's playing against you, but it doesn't have that, who knows? It has the, I do know, and it's bad. And so those emotional responses are not purely emotional. They're an intuitive, learned reaction to facts about the game, and those facts, like certain players, have an outsized impact for good or for ill, and I'm not getting it. And so that's related to, I think the alternative of saying, well, we're just going to watch and we'll use our own minds to guess which moments are important and which ones aren't, I think is massively throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But I would still love to be able to do something with it. And I mentioned at the beginning of this spiel that I had tweaked just trying to leverage, just to use the leverage itself. Say that minutes where the game was really in dispute, late in ties and so on, would somehow show people's character more. And it turns out that just happened to be wrong. If you do this, you just get worse predictions. So I haven't given up hope. I'd still love to do something along these lines. But it will have to be a lot more subtle in order to be worth the complexity and the trouble of doing it.
No doubt. And the Datsuk example definitely rings true, I think, for folks who are, trying to understand that gravity concept. I mean, for people who watched his entire career in Detroit, you go from his 2001, 2002 season where all of the defenders would get right up in his space, and then all of a sudden he started embarrassing people. And it was, he was deking you inside and out. In fact, Scotty Bowman had to tell him at one point, you already beat him once. You don't need to beat him again. Just carry on with yourself and continue going. You don't need to beat them a second time. And then all of a sudden you sort of saw a shift in the way people defended him. And now he's given so much space, and it completely changes, how people played against him. And I remember Drew Doughty even said at one point, you don't know whether to go forward, you don't know whether to go backward, you don't know what to do with him because you don't know what's coming. And so I think that's a great analogy to what you're trying to describe. And I think along those lines, one of the things that I love about your work and what you do is you are constantly innovating. Every summer, I always look forward to the next write-up. I'm already looking forward to Magnus 7 this year. But I want to talk about a couple of things you added this past season, which is the setting and finishing terms. And I was hoping you might be able to just broadly describe what is setting, what is finishing, and what do those numbers mean for people when they want to apply those?
So in the XG model itself, just in the danger of chances specifically, I try to layer all of the terms that are in that so that you can interpret it at a bunch of different levels. So the most important thing, obviously, is where the shot is taken from. And after that, you want to know, is it a slap shot or is it a wrist shot or is it a backhand? Because the different shot types use the rink so differently. And then, you're layering on more and more interesting things after that. And typically, when I'm quoting plain XG figures to people, I stop at a level before you get to the identities, the names on the backs of any of the people. But, so when I say that this is such and such a chance, then that's the value of the chance itself, not knowing that it's this person shooting the puck or that person trying to save it, which is the most obvious pair of people who are involved. And then you can go one step further and you can say, well, okay, what if I actually know that it is Datsuk shooting the puck and it's, whoever in net? Then that changes your opinion. If you know that it's so-and-so in net, then they're that much more likely to be in position. Whereas obviously if the goalie's out of position, then you have a better chance of scoring. And, but I keep that separate because I want, for two reasons. One is that I like it conceptually. I like to be able to say this is the chance itself. And then this is how well those players did with that chance. And also because that second level allows me to say, after a certain amount of time, a certain number of shots, this goalie is consistently not playing these chances very well. Or this one is playing much, much better. And so at that level, I've had some kind of terms for a few years. And so I call those terms finishing terms for the shooters and goalie terms for the goalies. And they're sort of neatly, symmetrically matched. Which is one of those reasons too, where every now and again people are like, oh, wouldn't you love to have goalie positioning in your XG model if you could? And I always say no. There are lots of terms I would love to have, but goalie positioning is not one of those terms. I don't think that is part of XG. I think that's part of goalie talent. You might score on a bad chance really easily because the goalie is, literally in the stands. And that doesn't mean that the chance was a good chance. It just means the goalie played it really, really badly. Similarly, just because you're playing a great goalie doesn't mean the good chances you're generating aren't good. So that's I really want that conceptual distinction. But I hadn't until last summer included anything about any of the other players on the ice. So the defenders on the ice, I try to get a hold of with a bunch of proxies of one kind or another. If it's in the immediate shadow of a power play, what does that what does that mean about how the people are standing? Does that mean the goals are less likely or more likely? And so you try to get at the data you don't have in whatever way you can. But the specific details of who passes the puck to the person who scores, we kind of have a bead on. In particular, when shots do go in the net, we have that listed, right? We call it assists. And even when we don't, we can still guess because we know who is on the ice. And I discovered this was kind of one of those things, it's not one of those burning, I wish I had this data, I wish I could do something with this. It was more the other way around where I was just kind of thinking, maybe there's something here. And I was quite surprised to learn that actually it seems to be quite independent of all of the other skills that I've ever been able to measure. So it seems like its own talent to be able not just to pass the puck, which obviously generates more shots, you'd see that come out in all sorts of things, but to pass the puck specifically to a player that you intend to shoot. And so I needed a name for that. And so hockey already has this term playmaking, which is just a little too general for my tastes. There's lots of different plays you can make, but this is a specific kind of playmaking. And so I called it setting, because of my wife's suggestion, actually. She's not a hockey fan. She doesn't like to talk shop with me. But she played volleyball extremely well in her youth. And when she unfortunately maxed out at 5'2", so volleyball could not continue for her. But when I was telling her about this thing, I'm exploring this thing about the kinds of passes you make to people you expect to shoot. And she was like, oh, setting. And I thought, no, that's exactly right. This is precisely, and volleyball has this precise terminology and a job, right? A person whose job it is to make exactly these passes. And if you don't, like in volleyball, it's really clear. If you don't attack after a set, you have screwed up. You probably lost the point immediately. And these passes are the same in hockey too, where you can tell you can watch them trail just off the edge of somebody's tape, where you can see that they're not like regular passes. That they're not just, oh, let's try to improve our situation. They're very clearly like the beginning of the attacking play, even if they're not themselves shots. And, but that detail turned out to be a surprisingly important thing. And it was one of those aspects where once I got it, I couldn't believe I never had it before.
I mean, honestly, I'm happy to know that the setting term is from volleyball, because that was the first thing that came to my mind. Was it was absolutely related to that. And for those watching on the YouTube stream, Sean had to dip out to go ask Jamie Benn why he cross-checked Mark Stone in the neck. And so that is where Sean has left. And so, Micah, I've just got one last question for you to sort of wrap this up. We talk a lot about the gap between public and private models. Things, it's sort of mentioned that, yes, private models have access to a lot more variables that we don't have access to. But in sort of your opinion, how big is that gap? How much of that data is going to be particularly useful? And kind of my follow-up question really is, how many people would truly even be equipped to handle that data at this point?
So there's a bunch of aspects. First of all, equipped is the word, and you would need more than just intelligence and stubbornness, and background knowledge. You would also need a small army of computers at your disposal to use the kind of data that characterizes what private data sets are providing that public ones are not. The detail really is, and so you need an extra set of skills. It gets to the point where, data engineering is a weakness of mine. I don't do it particularly well. I do what I need to so that I can do what I need to do, but I don't do it particularly well, and I definitely don't enjoy it. So if I were working in a team, not necessarily an NHL team, but a team of workers where I had like an engineer, a bevy of computers, a really good connection, a pipeline that would let me use all of it, visualize all of it, see what I was doing, test it. That's actually pretty serious. It's kind of like saying, what's the difference between like living in a mansion and living in a small hovel? Like, well, the primary difference is just that it's so much larger. And then though, if you're trying to ask what can you do with it, then it's much less clear. Where on the one hand, like to give you a really proper answer, I would have to have this data and then have this team of people and do however much work. I have possibly self-serving suspicion that there isn't that much to do in addition to the data that we've already got, just based on how important shot location seems to be relative to all of the other things. And that there's something really basically physical about if you are that much closer, it will be that much easier to score. And that the physics of that, of reaction time, of speed, of distance, I think is going to dominate over almost everything else that you could come up with. Not that I wouldn't, like, especially if I was working for a team directly, you would obviously want to have all of that. But I wonder if the improvements you get are going to be thinner than some people would like. If you didn't, shot location is so important, and we do already have that. And so my suspicion is that we already have the most vital elements.
That makes a ton of sense. And we talked about this a little bit with Josh and Luke, because they published from their XG model when they did this a couple years back in the first iteration, just what the variable importance was. And I mean, you can absolutely see shot location is 3 to 4 times more important than the next closest variable. And so by far it dominates, in terms of the most important things we consider when, trying to generate the likelihood of a shot being a goal. And so I think it's a fascinating question. It's one that comes up a lot, and greatly appreciate your perspective on it. Micah, I think we're all looking forward to Magnus 7. I hope hard drive failures are a thing of the past, and we look forward to every iteration you've got. Is there anything else that you're working on that you'd like the opportunity to shout out here?
Well, I'm actually, much against my previously stated principles, I'm actually working on a kind of all-in-one stat for player evaluation. Something I've commented in the past. I don't like, philosophically, I don't like a lot of the all-in-one stats. I don't like WAR. I'm not particularly fond of it for baseball, even, let alone for hockey. I don't like the mentality that goes into it. But I think I've managed somehow. There's another casualty of the hard drive failures you were talking about. A recent casualty of that is that I had a couple of weeks of work put into that. So that will have to wait until the end of the summer now. But I think I have a way of sensibly comparing skaters to goalies and also to one another in a way that should be context neutral, and also include more than just their impact on shots, which is obviously the most important thing, which is why we've been talking about it so much. But also, are they moving the puck up the ice? Are they drawing penalties? Are they doing all those other things that you could do, or failing to help their team? And so I'm watch for that towards the end of the summer.
Well, we are all excited to see what you come up with there, as well as the Magnus 7 output and really everything that you contribute to the community on an annual basis. I think it goes without saying that HockeyViz is one of the premier sites, and everybody should give Micah money. If you don't, I suspect most people who listen to this podcast already do give Micah money, but if you don't, please go to HockeyViz.com, subscribe, get access to all of the stuff we just talked about and more. And most importantly, Micah is probably the best person on the planet to listen to present at a hockey analytics conference. So the next time we have one of those back, I look forward to hearing what you've come up with since then. So Micah, appreciate you taking the time today.
Thank you very much. You're too kind. Hopefully I'll see you soon.
Absolutely. Thank you to Micah again for taking the time out of his day to join us. And if you aren't already subscribed to HockeyViz.com, please go ahead and subscribe. Give Micah your money. It allows him to create lots of very nice things that help us better understand the world of hockey. So to wrap up here today, folks, we're recording this right before Game 6 between Vegas and Dallas. And as we are recording this, we're getting some information that the Dallas Stars have made an interesting roster scratch in order to bring Jamie Benn back in. Sean, I'm going to toss it to you when it comes to understanding the dynamics of having to make these changes as a coach. What are you thinking about here as you see the Stars react to bringing Jamie Benn back in?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's funny, this episode is jumping all over the timelines, right? We're breaking the fourth wall of, I think, not only did I re-recorded the interview with Micah when I was down in Dallas, and I was at a shady back restaurant down, and now had to leave, and now Game 6 is happening. But yeah, tonight Jamie Benn comes back to the lineup, and I was actually talking to Dmitry Filipovich about this earlier today, where the broadcast storyline, and if the Stars win tonight and force a Game 7, the storyline is going to be Jamie Benn rallied the Stars, and I feel kind of uneasy, and I really don't like that narrative, because it was one thing for Joe Pavelski to come back from a concussion. It's another thing to be like praising a guy who showed no remorse for assault. Like that's what it was. I have no, like, he showed no remorse for assault and had, like, just to think he should get the benefit of the, like, oh, he's back in the lineup, rah. Like, I hate that storyline. I actually hope if Dallas wins and does this whole thing, I would really prefer, it would make everyone's life better if they win tonight in spite of Ben, almost, because them winning because of Ben, I really don't want to see I don't want to see the reward for a suspension and coming back. Like, I really don't want that. Anywho, Stars are making it. So when Ben came out, it was the same time Evgeny Dadonov also came out of the lineup. And I think that's something where Dallas coming back to force a Game 6, one of the things that is understated is, obviously everyone made a big deal about Ben coming out, but losing Dadonov was actually a bigger deal than I think people realize, because the Stars throughout that series have struggled in transition, struggled in 5-on-5 play, and Dadonov had been one of their better players. The fact that he goes out and then the team gets better in transition when Dadonov comes out, I think, is the bigger story that kind of gets lost by captain cross-checking another captain in the neck. But part of the fallout of that is by Ben and Dadonov coming out, there's space for a Fredrik Olofsson to come into the lineup. And Fredrik Olofsson's a guy who only played a couple NHL games this year, but he came in on the fourth line and he gave Dallas... He played with Luke Glendening, who Red Wings fans know really well, and played with Radek Faksa, and comes in and gave Dallas really four lines that all had speed and purpose. Yoel Kiviranta, Max Domi, Ty Dellandre had that third line that famously scored 2 goals in Game 5 in the third period. They came together, and they had a fourth line that had purpose. And Ben, you're not going to not put your captain back in the lineup. We all know that's going to happen. But so you have a decision to make. And the Stars didn't, in my view on this, they made the regular season decision as opposed to the playoff decision. The playoff decision is supposed to be what's the best chance to win the game. The regular season decision is how do we massage egos and justify big free agent signings. And Mason Marchment has been very bad in the playoffs. He's just been bad. He's been bad in the playoffs. He was bad in the regular season, even though he dealt with some injuries. He's not been good. And he's staying in the lineup. And Ben's coming in, and Marchment goes to the fourth line, and it becomes the fourth line of Marchment, Fox, and Glendening. And we talked about time stamping things. I'm going to timestamp this right now on Monday, May 29th at 7:50 p.m. when we're talking, because I think it's a big mistake Dallas is making. I think it's by taking, you're basically neutering your fourth line, the speed on your fourth line. You're taking away what was effective when you should have just gone like for like and put it in. And I think it's kind of a hockey, like, there's a hockey pecking order that I feel like we need to, even the coaches who are good at understanding roles sometimes put too much of, well, this guy is a veteran or this guy was signed for big money, so he has to stay in. And I think Dallas is making one of those classic mistakes tonight where I think you're thinking too much about, we signed this guy and he cost a lot of money, as opposed to what is actually our best chance of winning tonight. And I think Pete DeBoer is actually sometimes pretty sharp compared to some coaches. But in general, this just shows, like, too often we get into guy made a lot of money. Let's justify it. Let's protect egos, when we're not doing, what's the biggest point here? To win games. And that's my soapbox.
Honestly, it's hard to argue with it, because even if you want to just step back and look at the results from that fourth line, with Olofsson, Glendening, and Faksa, I mean, they play 16 minutes at 5-on-5 in the 2 games. They have a 5-on-5 expected goals for percentage of 78% while they're out there. And not only that, they're scoring big goals, not giving up anything. And to sort of disrupt that dynamic, to bring Ben back in, it really does, sit weirdly for me. And this is as someone who's not, watched the Stars a ton this year, but did pick them to win the Stanley Cup. I just want to put that plug out there. This just feels a little odd. I really liked what Olofsson brought, just like you said. I thought that fourth line had been really, really good. We will see, if this completely upsets the dynamic. And honestly, if it does, I don't mind that being the case, as that's the retribution for Jamie Benn and his vicious two-handed, I don't even know. Cross-check just feels too light. And Wings fans have seen this way too much from him, particularly ending Dylan Larkin's season with no remorse whatsoever. I got to say, if this is how it ends on that kind of decision, it's not the end of the world. But like you said, Sean, I'm really rooting for, if the Stars pull this out, it's not because of Jamie Benn.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think it's, even the most ardent Stars fan turned on Ben after that cross-check and the lack of sympathy, rightfully so. And so right now it's fun to root for the Stars from a Joe Pavelski, like it's, if the Stars win the Stanley Cup and pull this off and everything like that, San Jose will have the parade the way Boston did when Ray Bourque won in Colorado. That's what we're talking about. Like, the Sharks literally changed their Twitter logo to go all in on the Stars. So it's if you want to jump on the Stars bandwagon, is it on a national stage? It's for Joe Pavelski. It's for rooting for American goaltending, all that stuff with Jake Ottinger. It's not because of the guy who showed no remorse for assault with a hockey stick on a guy who had back surgery this year. So I really hope, and for this game, if I would love to see more hockey, so I would love to see the Stars win tonight and force Game 7. I don't want another game though of the storyline and the narrative of, well, they did it for the captain, they did it for Ben, and whatever thing like that, because I that's a reward for a heinous act, and so that's what I'm rooting for watching this game as we go into it.
I'm 100% there with you. I'll throw back one last anecdote for Wings fans who remember the 2007 Western Conference Final where Chris Pronger smashed Thomas Holmstrom's head into the boards, got suspended one game. The Ducks managed to pull that out and ultimately eliminate the Wings and win the Stanley Cup. And you know what? Never forgave Chris Pronger for that. And all those narratives that came out about, the Ducks holding on for Pronger and allowing him to get back into the series. Load of crap. So with that being said, that'll do it for us here for this episode of Expected by Whom. Appreciate everybody tuning in. We will be back on our regular schedule with an episode this Friday. Tune in as we've got a really exciting interview for you guys there with an NHL front office member. And with that being said, if you've got any feedback, comments, questions, please direct those to the direct messages of Ryan Hanna on Twitter.
And yeah, I'm going to let that stay in there, this random poorly muted button there. But yeah, thank you for listening. We're going to have a really fun one this week. And I think people are going to be excited when they see kind of some of the future guests we have too on this. So it's going to be fun.
Looking forward to it. Thanks, everybody.